My name is Diana Harlow. 3 years ago, I would have told you I had the perfect life, a beautiful home, a successful husband, a little girl who called me her best friend. What almost nobody knew was that I had built every inch of that life myself, long before Owen ever put a ring on my finger. That night started with a sound no mother ever wants to hear. My daughter Lily, 4 years old, was breathing in short, ragged gasps from behind her bedroom door. I found her curled under a damp blanket, her cheeks flushed a deep, alarming red, her small body shaking despite the heat radiating off her skin. The thermometer read 104 degrees. Her lips looked dry and cracked, and when I tried to get her to drink water, she barely swallowed it. "Mommy," she whispered, barely able to keep her eyes open. "I'm so tired." Something in my chest went cold. I wrapped her in a blanket, grabbed her medical bag, and moved fast toward the front door. Downstairs, I could hear music, laughter, the clink of champagne glasses. My mother-in-law Eleanor had spent 3 weeks planning a dinner for nearly 50 guests. I didn't care. My daughter needed a hospital, and nothing else in that house mattered. I made it as far as the marble hallway before Eleanor stepped directly into my path. She was dressed in a silk gown the color of dark wine, adjusting a string of pearls at her throat like the rest of the world could wait. She didn't even glance at Lily. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice sharp and flat. "Our guests are arriving in 20 minutes. You were supposed to be supervising the kitchen staff. It's a fever, Diana. Give her medicine and stop embarrassing this family in front of people who matter. Move, Eleanor," I said. "My daughter needs a doctor." That was when the study door opened and my husband stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks like he was heading to a photo shoot instead of standing 3 feet from his sick child. He looked at us not with worry but with irritation. "Diana, stop being dramatic," Owen said, exhaling like I had ruined his whole night. "Give her the medicine in her bag and get downstairs. My uncle is bringing 3 investors tonight. Stop being so selfish." I stood there holding our burning, trembling daughter, and my husband called me selfish. I looked around that hallway, the imported marble under our feet, the chandelier above our heads, the art on the walls that I had personally selected and paid for, and I understood something with total clarity. These 2 people were willing to gamble my daughter's life to protect their reputation with strangers. "Get out of my way," I said, and I stepped forward. Owen's face changed. Without a single word of warning, he lunged, not toward his daughter but toward me. His open hand cracked across my face with enough force that I stumbled into the wall, my lips splitting against my own teeth. I tightened my arms around Lily so she wouldn't slip, and I felt blood pool against my tongue. Eleanor watched the whole thing with something close to satisfaction. Owen pointed a shaking finger at me. "How dare you talk back to my mother in our house? Walk out that door and you leave with nothing. No money, no house, no custody of that little girl." He genuinely believed I was a helpless woman who survived on his paycheck. He expected tears, an apology, surrender. Instead, something inside me went quiet. The version of me that had spent years keeping the peace died right there in that hallway. I didn't cry. I wiped the blood from my lip with the back of my hand, and I felt the panic drain out of me, replaced by something colder and steadier than I had ever felt. I actually smiled. It must have unsettled him because Owen took a small step back. "Our house, Owen?" I asked quietly. "Let's talk about that." To understand why that sentence made Owen's face go pale, you need to understand who I was before I became his wife in the eyes of his family. I grew up with very little. My mother raised me alone after my father left, working 2 jobs just to keep our small apartment heated through winter. I promised myself I would never depend on anyone else to survive. By 19, I was working retail during the day and taking online finance courses at night. By 23, I had saved enough to make my first small investment in a distressed rental property nobody wanted. I fixed it up myself, rented both units, and used the income to buy a second property, then a third. By 28, I owned a genuinely profitable real estate portfolio held under a holding company I had quietly built and named after my grandmother, the one person who had always believed in me. I never talked about it at parties. I simply kept building, the way people do when they have learned that security is something you create for yourself. I met Owen at a charity gala. He was charming in the practiced way of someone raised to charm. Good family name, good manners. A mother who had spent his entire childhood telling him he was destined for greatness. What he didn't have, and what his family had quietly run through over to generations, was money. Their names still opened doors, but behind those doors the accounts were nearly empty. Eleanor's late husband had left behind more debt than assets, and Owen's own business ventures had failed twice before I ever met him. I fell for him anyway. I fell for the version of him he showed me in those early years. Attentive, warm, endlessly complimentary. When we married, I purchased the mansion we lived in. $12 million paid through my holding company, and I put it entirely in my name. Not because I distrusted Owen exactly, but because I had learned young never to build my security on someone else's foundation. I also set up a monthly allowance from my company's returns, $25,000 a month, meant to cover the mansion's upkeep, staff wages, and give Owen breathing room while he tried unsuccessfully to rebuild his career. Over time, that allowance became the thing that funded Eleanor's dinner parties, Owen's tailored suits, the appearance of a family that had never actually recovered its fortune. They lived like royalty inside a house they didn't own, funded by an allowance they didn't earn. And somewhere along the way they convinced themselves it was theirs by right. Standing in that marble hallway with blood in my mouth and my daughter burning up in my arms, I finally said the words I had swallowed for years. This house is in my name, Owen. Every deed, every mortgage payment, every renovation, mine. The company that pays your mother's caterers and your tailor and the wine cellar she just had installed, also mine. You have never paid for a single thing in this house. The color drained from his face so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Eleanor let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's absurd. Owen, tell her that's absurd. But Owen wasn't laughing. He was staring at me like he was seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time in 5 years. I didn't wait for either of them to recover. I walked straight past them, out the front door, into the cool night air. With Lily still trembling against my chest, I drove straight to the emergency room. Lily was dehydrated and the doctors watched her closely for several hours, running fluids and monitoring for signs of a febrile seizure. Before her temperature finally began to drop, she fell asleep holding my hand, her small fingers curled around mine, and I sat beside her hospital bed and finally allowed myself 3 minutes to shake. Then I made the phone call. I called Marcus, an attorney who had handled my company's legal affairs for almost a decade. Marcus, it's Diana, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I need you to start the process tonight. Full separation, and I want a full audit of every account tied to the company, effective immediately. Say the word, he replied, and it's already moving. Marcus moved fast. Within 48 hours, formal separation paperwork was filed along with a request for a protective order based on the hospital's documentation of my injury. But it was something Marcus found 3 days later, buried in the audit. That turned this from a divorce into something closer to a reckoning. 6 weeks earlier, someone had contacted my company's registered agent requesting a copy of the holding company's formation documents, the paperwork that established, in plain legal language, exactly who owned what. The request had come from a small law office Marcus didn't recognize. When he traced it, the retainer had been paid by Eleanor. She hadn't just been planning a dinner party that night. She had been quietly building a case with a lawyer of her own to argue that, because Owen had lived in the house for 5 years and contributed his name and social standing to my company's growth, he was entitled to a claim on it. It was a long shot legally, built on almost nothing. But Marcus found something else in that file that made my stomach turn. A draft document, never filed, that used a signature block matching mine on a request to add Owen as co-signer to my company's primary operating account. The signature wasn't mine. It had never been submitted because the bank's verification process had quietly rejected it months earlier without ever alerting me. Eleanor had been trying to help her son claim ownership of something that was never his. And when that failed quietly, she decided the fastest remaining path was to make my life miserable enough that I'd hand it over willingly. The dinner party ultimatum, the pressure, even the moment in that hallway, none of it was really about a fever. It was about control. When Marcus laid it all out for me in his office, I didn't feel afraid. I felt something closer to clarity. These weren't people testing the limits of a marriage. They were people who had been quietly circling my life for years, waiting for an opening. I gave Marcus one instruction: pursue everything the law allowed and hold nothing back. Owen called me 11 times that first week. I let every call go to voicemail. On the 12th, I finally answered. "Vivian, please," he said, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard before. "We can fix this. My mother went too far. I know that. But you can't just take everything. Where am I supposed to live?" "You should have thought about that," I said quietly, "before you decided our daughter's fever mattered less than your uncle's investors. And before you let your mother go looking for a lawyer to take my company." There was a long silence. I don't think he knew I had found that file. His own hastily hired attorneys quickly discovered there was almost nothing to contest. Nearly every major asset, the mansion, the holding company, the investment accounts, had been protected as separate property from the very beginning, held solely under my name with no commingled funds. The attempted signature addition, once flagged to the court, effectively ended any argument Owen's team tried to make about implied ownership. Within weeks, the mansion was formally listed for sale through my company, and Owen and Eleanor were served notice to vacate. Eleanor showed up at Marcus's office uninvited, demanding to speak with me directly. I agreed to one meeting. "You would really do this to your own husband?" she said, her voice trembling with fury. "Throw an old woman out onto the street? You threw a sick 4-year-old under a blanket and told her mother to go serve appetizers." I replied evenly. "And then you tried to forge a signature to take my company." "I'm simply removing myself and my daughter from a family that was capable of both." She had no answer for that. At the first custody hearing, the judge reviewed the hospital records, documenting the timeline of that night. The photographs Marcus had insisted I take of my injury before I left the house, and Eleanor's own text messages obtained through discovery instructing household staff to keep the child upstairs and quiet during the party. The judge granted me primary custody on a temporary basis, with Lily's contact with Owen to be supervised in the meantime. 6 months later, the mansion sold for slightly above asking price. Owen moved into a modest 1-bedroom apartment across town. Eleanor, without her son's household to preside over and without an allowance to fund her lifestyle. Moved in with a distant cousin to states away. I heard secondhand that she still tells people her daughter-in-law stole everything. She has never once mentioned what happened to Lily that night or the file Marcus found. I used part of the proceeds from the sale to buy a smaller home just for Lily and me. Nothing extravagant, but warm, quiet, and entirely ours. No marble hallways, no dinner parties I was expected to disappear into. Just a kitchen where I cook because I want to, and a living room where Lily does her puzzles on the floor while I work nearby. She's healthy now, thriving. She still talks sometimes about the hospital night in the simple, unbothered way. Small children process frightening things, and each time she does I remind her that I will always choose her, without hesitation, over anyone else's comfort or reputation. I kept building my company. It has grown since the divorce finalized, not in spite of what happened, but almost because of it. I stopped spending my energy managing other people's expectations and started spending it on the thing I was actually good at. The custody case closed permanently a year later with primary custody firmly mine, and Owen's visits limited to supervised time. He now shows up far more consistently than he ever did when Lily lived under his roof. I don't regret a single choice I made walking out of that house. I regret only that it took 104-degree fever, a split lip, and a forged signature to finally show me what I had already built for myself years before I ever needed it. If the walls around you were never really theirs to begin with, if the roof over your head, the money in the accounts, the whole life you were told to be grateful for actually belonged to you all along, how long would you stay silent before you finally said so?